My name is Ben, and today I'll be discussing the Ladino press using machine learning to excavate visual content in historic Ladino newspapers. And this work is very much in collaboration with Devin Nahr. I would also like to thank the Willner family. I'm honored to be this year's Richard and Ida Willner Memorial Fellow here at the Stroum Center. And with that, I'll go ahead and get started. So the goal here is to spend about 15 to 20 minutes situating my work, but to leave ample time for questions and of course for my other fellows here on the call as well. So I'll generally start by introducing the Ladino press, then turn to Newspaper Navigator, and then lastly turn to the intersection of this work, which really concerns the application of my dissertation work or dissertation project called Newspaper Navigator to the Ladino press. Okay, so I'd like to situate this all within the Sephardic Studies Digital Library here at the University of Washington, which of course captures the rich Sephardic experience through all sorts of cultural heritage, including over 1,000 documents and over 100,000 pages of materials. And in particular, I'd like to focus on the newspapers in particular the Ladino press. And here's a visualization put together by the Stroum Center, which just captures how rich the press was, spanning, of course, multiple continents with hundreds of titles. And in particular, I'll be focusing on a handful of titles that are digitized here within the Sephardic Studies Digital Library. And the work here generally asks, what can we learn from the Ladino press? And I'd like to introduce or motivate this work through Sarah Stein's wonderful book, Making Jews Modern, the Yiddish and Ladino Press in the Russian and Ottoman Empires. And she says, it is precisely in newspapers with their plurality of subject matter and authors, their immediate reactions to cultural and political events, their need to appeal to many kinds of readers, and not least the responses provided by their readerships, that emerging Jewish modernities may be read most vividly. And so I think this really captures how this work fits into the questions surrounding modernities, which is the topic of this panel today. In particular, I'll be looking at a number of newspaper titles, including Lavara here, shown from 1930, and then also El Tiempo, which I'll show in a minute. But I like showing the newspaper pages themselves because I think it gives a sense of the experience of reading a newspaper page. Of course, we think about them as very textual sources, and of course, we'd read many different articles, but we also see how visual the newspaper page is. There's a very recurring visual grammar to newspapers that we all understand, and of course, here we see both advertisements and cartoons, etc. And in El Tiempo, we find very similar types of advertisements appearing pretty regularly throughout the newspaper. And Sarah Stein devotes a significant amount of her book to understanding the advertisements themselves. And I like this because it actually situates this kind of analysis of the press instead of through purely the textual content, but also through advertising and what's being visually depicted. And so what can we begin to ask? Well, I think Sarah Stein gives us a sense. She says the majority of El Tiempo's advertisements promoted services that would alleviate readers' anxiety about the fragility of life under Ottoman rule. These texts attempted to capitalize on apprehensions about the ever-present threats of fire, bankruptcy, bureaucratic inefficiency, poverty, and political disenfranchisement, and perhaps most of all, on readers' nervousness about being left behind by a European economy increasingly dependent on the West. And so I like this because it gives us a sense of what we can begin to learn through this visual content. And I'd also like to motivate this from the perspective of machine learning, actually, which of course is my home discipline. In particular, understanding the ways or the profound implications of machine learning in terms of perpetuating marginalization or erasure. I'm sure many of you have encountered terms such as algorithmic bias, but we actually find this within the Ladino press itself. I think really any work with the machine learning and cultural heritage necessitates this kind of critical socio-technical lens. But in the context of the Ladino press, this issue is particularly manifest because of the challenges of optical character recognition, or OCR for short, which is effectively these algorithms that can transcribe text on the page. And what we find is that most of the standard OCR engines that people run will fail to transcribe Ladino properly because the Rashi script on the page is interpreted as Hebrew. And so in a sense, there's this further algorithmic mediation or marginalization of Sephardic studies as a field, where it becomes increasingly difficult to be able to do, say, keyword search or other things against the newspapers that we would expect with, say, English language newspapers. And so I'd like to ask, how can we begin to think about correctives for the fact that we cannot do macroscopic analysis at the text level? And once again, here, I think this is where we can begin to look at the visual content instead. And to tie this back to my own dissertation work, a central project of mine is called Newspaper Navigator. And the idea behind this project is precisely to look at the visual content in historic newspaper pages, both in terms of extracting it and then in terms of reimagining how we can search over it. And so I began this project in 2019 through the Library of Congress's Innovator in Residence program. And in particular, I was inspired by a crowdsourcing initiative that they had launched in about 2017 with the goal of engaging the American public through this rich visual content. And in particular, they asked volunteers to identify 5 different types. So photos, illustrations, maps, comics, and editorial cartoons. Note down the caption, and then also, there was some verification process that resulted in thousands of these verified annotations, giving us bounding boxes of extracted visual content from their newspaper corpus known as Chronicling America. And so here I'm just showing a small sampling. And I think this not only gives us a sense of what we can begin to learn, but also I became interested in this from the perspective of machine learning and understanding if we could use this as some sort of source of training data. In the context of the Library of Congress, I was thinking about, quote unquote, opening the treasure chest of this rich visual content. And the idea being we could take a newspaper page, feed it into this trained machine learning model that would then draw these bounding boxes around different types of visual content and then classify it according to that taxonomy on the fly. And so I very briefly just want to give 1 minute of motivation for the machine learning here. If I say anything that doesn't make sense, that's my fault and my fault only, but I'm happy to return to it in the questions as well. But in machine learning these days, in a couple of sentences, there's this really common paradigm known as pre-training and fine-tuning. The idea being you take a machine learning model that's already been trained on some sort of massive data set that lots of people use, and then you train it some more or fine tune it on a data set that's of interest to your specific task. So here we can take a model that's already been trained on a really big object detection data set and then fine tune it some more by training it on the beyond words annotations coming from the crowdsourcing initiative. And so here, to give the real analogy, object detection refers to these kinds of machine learning models that can take in an image and then draw bounding boxes around, say, the dog or the bicycle or the truck on the image. And there's this very natural analogy between doing that and then drawing bounding boxes around, say, an advertisement or a cartoon on a newspaper page. And that's precisely what this fine tuning is doing. We take something that knows how to do the left and then train it some more so it can do the task on the right, which of course is very relevant to what we're interested in. And so once we have this trained model, we can feed in pages and get back out predictions. And so I have some resources available for this portion of the project, including the training data and all of the code for training this model. And I raise this and also say that this is all in the public domain because this visual content recognition model is pretty central to my work with Devin. And in particular, Devin and I had been chatting for a number of years about possible, research collaborations, and we realized that there was this really, great opportunity to try to apply this machine learning model to the Ladino newspapers to effectively try to extract visual content and then provide analysis that I had mentioned before. And so we really think of it, I guess, in 2 parts. The first part being extracting all of this visual content from the Ladino press, and the second part then being reimagining how we then search over it in order to analyze it. And so we used this model from Newspaper Navigator. We processed about 15,500 pages. I'll have some more details in a second, but the idea here is to use cloud computing to do this. So here's a brief breakdown of the Ladino titles included in our analysis. So we're spanning multiple continents from about 50 years, 1890 to 1940. You can see that the critical mass of pages, I would say, are from Lavara. We have about 10,000, and then El Tiempo about 3,600. But we still have a number of other titles that I think give us different slices, different leanings, different content, and of course, different publication locations as well. And so in terms of the visual content identified, without going into too much detail, we've identified what we think of roughly, tens of thousands of advertisements, but still hundreds of photos and then illustrations, maps, etc. I do want to briefly note that, of course, one of the strange things about working with a machine learning model is what we get back is not perfect. There'll be misclassifications, things that haven't been included, extra things that are included. But by and large, this at least gives us a general sense of what's going on. And so I think one goal here that we have is we have this data set sitting, for our own analysis, but we really like to make this data set publicly available, not only to encourage more engagement with the Ladino press and also more digital humanities research, but I think also just to serve it for public interest as well. So now let me turn to the sort of second aspect of this project, which asks, how do we now search over this visual content? If we now have tens of thousands of advertisements, we'd like to be able to draw some insights. And here there are some fundamental challenges in the sense that we don't have any captions for the extracted visual content because, of course, we don't have reliable OCR, which means that we can't really do keyword search over these images. And so there are really two options we can think about. One is by searching by different kinds of axes or dimensions like title or date of publication. And this, of course, is great for getting a general sense of what was appearing in, say, Lavara in 1930. But it would also be great to be able to draw insights across multiple pages or multiple titles and really ask the question of how we can infer trends. And here we can also use machine learning techniques, in particular to search by visual similarity, leveraging these machine learning techniques that actually sort of capture what we might call the quote unquote semantics of an image. So not just that the image has blue in it, but rather that this image is showing dolphins in the ocean. And so now we can begin to start to use this analysis to cluster images in this data set that we've constructed to try to understand the kind of visual culture appearing in the Ladino press. And so here I'm showing a visualization of 348 photographs extracted from this collection. And this sort of macroscopic view, it's hard to infer anything, but if we'll zoom in, we'll actually be able to start to get a sense of what's appearing in the press. So in particular, here is a collection we see of portrait shots of individuals, many of which are actually obituaries. So this begins to give us a sense of what's appearing or what are common motifs. We also find wartime photographs. These, of course, are relevant to the time, and then also crowds of people. But I might also, reinterpret this through the lens of community, and we can also begin to start to look at these captions to understand who precisely are appearing. As I had mentioned, though, the advertisements are also a really rich source to begin to engage with per Sarah Stein's work. And so here I'm showing a visualization of about 3,000 advertisements extracted from 1936 to 1938 within Lavara. And once again, we see some of these clusters emerging in this visualization, but if we zoom in, we'll be able to get a better sense of what's going on. And in particular, what we begin to find is actually these advertisements that are being reproduced. And so these reproduced advertisements are not being redundantly identified by this machine learning model, but rather are reflecting advertisements that appear in many different issues. And so here on the left, we see 30, 40 advertisements showing Brockman Monument works. We have Meyer London's matzahs, and then a number of advertisements for aristocratic imported virgin olive oil. But these, this kind of analysis allows us to move, I think, from the static page to really begin to start to think about networks of advertisers appearing in multiple different titles across time, understanding who's appearing where. I do want to mention that Devin and I are currently preparing a book chapter on this work. Here's a link to a conference that we presented at in case anyone's interested. But I do want to end on the note of what the future work here is, because this is very much work in progress. And so I think I'm particularly excited about trying to understand what we can do now that we have this sort of, I'd say, groundwork analysis to be able to look at the visual content we're seeing and can try to bootstrap up. So I'd mentioned examining this network of advertisers appearing within the Ladino press, continuing to build on Sarah Stein's analysis of the advertisements in El Tiempo, understanding what kinds of advertisements are appearing and when, what the advertisers are trying to reflect, what readers' aspirations are. And I think we can really capture this at a rather macroscopic scale with this kind of analysis. Then we can also try to, say, examine reprinting patterns of advertisements and other images, not only within the Ladino ecosystem, but also beyond to the non-Ladino presses, using my work with Chronicling America as well to begin to try to get at this aspect of community as well. And then very lastly, I think sort of immediate work here is understanding how we can release this data set of extracted visual content for scholars and the public alike. And very briefly, I'd just like to thank a whole host of people at the Stroum Center, including Devin, Sarah, Noam Pianco, McKenna, and my entire fellows cohort, then my advisor, Dan Weld, and then a host of external collaborators. And of course, would like to acknowledge the Richard and Ida Willner Memorial Fellowship, and also state that this work is supported by a National Science Graduate Research Fellowship and the Library of Congress Innovator in Residence position.